My colleagues before, the usual disclaimers apply. So this work is research, it's not policy advice. The views and opinions expressed here are my own. They do not necessarily represent those of the New Zealand Treasury or the government. All errors are my own. It's very much work in progress, so any comments that can improve the analysis are very much welcome. Motivations, so some of these things have been discussed before in earlier presentations. The COVID shock has very much changed the economic landscape. So we're sort of predicting net debt to GDP to more than double from pre-COVID levels. So all else equal, this will have consequences for fiscal space and the government's ability to smooth future economic shocks. Now, of course, the low interest rate sort of helps a bit. It gives us a bit more fiscal space, but pre-COVID, that would have maybe been an issue. Pre-COVID, the government was targeting net debt to GDP target of 20% plus minus 5%. Treasury advice was that they could increase this to 30% over the next decade, factoring in a 20% fiscal buffer. So that would sort of get us to prudent debt under 50%. Current fiscal strategy is to stabilise net debt at current levels and then reduce as conditions permit. So as was mentioned earlier today, there are many factors that determine what an appropriate net debt to GDP target could or should be. Fiscal limits is one of those, so what's the maximum amount a government can borrow or can service? At what point does a government lose access to debt markets? At what point does net debt to GDP have effects on GDP growth, risk premia, interest rates? Fiscal space is another consideration, so how much net debt increases or needs to increase to smooth out shocks following recessions or these sorts of things. So that requires an understanding of what the fiscal response function is and also an understanding of what the shock distribution is, so we can calculate how large that buffer should be. Beyond sort of business cycle smoothing issues, if governments are making sort of large purchases, large investments they can't fund out of taxes, maybe there's an argument to fund that out of debt, especially if these sorts of assets are long-lived and that future taxpayers are going to benefit from them. Government debt may be a way that we can sort of spread those costs over future generations. Ultimately, if the government's deciding whether they should lower net debt to GDP, they should carry out a careful cost-benefit analysis, and this is sort of where this analysis fits in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a small open economy monetary fiscal DSU model parameterised to match New Zealand to try and work out what some of the fiscal and economic costs are. So I'll be primarily focusing on GDP costs of fiscal consolidation in New Zealand. So some may ask sort of why do this analysis given that even where sort of net debt to GDP is projected to peak, still going to be a whole lot lower than other countries. And I guess this analysis can be used both to sort of show how you might do a fiscal consolidation, but also you could use it as sort of a reason for not doing fiscal consolidation if you deem the costs to be too large. So what I'm interested in is working out which fiscal instruments are more or less costly to use when permanently lowering the level of government debt. I want to know how the size of the fiscal consolidation affects the cost. I want to know how the duration of the fiscal consolidation affects the cost. And I want to know how the interaction with the effective lower bound affects the cost. So I'll do a brief literature review. There is a large literature on austerity and fiscal consolidation. So I've just picked out a few key papers and a few key areas that I think are relevant. It's always good to learn from history. So Iken Green has a recent paper where he looks at periods in history where we have had high debt, and he looks at sort of which factors have contributed to lowering debt. He finds post-World War II that R minus G, so the differential between interest rates and growth, has played quite a large role in lowering debt, although they point out that that this is probably due to the role of financial repression, the idea that because financial markets were more regulated back then, investors were sort of held captive to lower interest rates, and that potentially this is not a mechanism we can use to going forward to lower net debt to GDP. On the empirical time series side, Alicina and co-authors, also known as the Bocconi boys, have done a lot of work in this area. So they've done nearly 30 years or more than 30 years of work in this area. They've combined all their research together in a book called Austerity, When It Works and When It Doesn't. So one of the main findings from their book is that tax-based fiscal consolidations are more costly in terms of GDP, and they're less likely to succeed. Expenditure-based fiscal consolidations are less costly in terms of GDP and more likely to succeed. And in a very small number of cases, fiscal consolidations can actually be expansionary. So that's when spending-based consolidations are used. So the idea is that the cut in government spending creates positive confidence effects, which crowds in private investment. Fatas in summer looks at fiscal consolidations that occurred during the GFC. They look at the permanent effects of fiscal consolidations, and they find that because these have negative effects on potential growth, that in some cases that these have been self-defeating, and that the net debt to GDP ratio has actually grown after the fiscal consolidation. So the structural models, this is sort of where my work fits in. Kirdan and co-authors were the first, or one of the first papers to look at modelling fiscal consolidations in a DSU model. They don't find any evidence for expansionary fiscal consolidations in their modelling work. Ursig and Linde is another key paper in this area. They look at fiscal consolidations and currency unions. They find there's a reversal of the Bocconi boys result that tax-based consolidations are actually less costly than expenditure-based consolidations. And then finally, Scheer looks at or introduces the fiscal sacrifice ratio, or was first introduced by Ursig and Linde, but Scheer refines that as a metric for sort of determining how costly fiscal sacrifice ratios are. Ostry is another key paper through the lens of a structural model. They look at sort of whether the benefits of a fiscal consolidation actually outweigh the costs. And they find that for countries that have ample fiscal space, in a lot of cases, the benefits of a fiscal consolidation may not outweigh the costs. Another key book is Blythe, who has a book called Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. So he attacks spending-based austerity mainly on ideological and fairness arguments, the fact that debt levels rose in Northern Hemisphere countries after GFC, as those countries were forced to bail out banks that primarily benefited richer people, whereas expenditure-based fiscal consolidation tends to have a large impact on poorer people who are sort of more dependent on transfers payments and government services. And then the last point I've got there is there's a whole discussion or debate at the moment about R minus G, the fact that interest rates are lower than growth. So people are sort of cautiously questioning debt sustainability and whether we need to be quite so concerned about the level of debt. So that sort of factors into the question of whether we should be doing a consolidation in the first place. So the methodology, I'm going to use a monetary fiscal DSU model parameterised to New Zealand to calculate the costs of a fiscal consolidation. The model looks very similar to a model that Eric Leeper and co-authors have used to investigate fiscal multipliers. So it's a small open economy monetary fiscal DSU model with sticky prices and wages, which are introduced through Rotenberg adjustment costs. There's government debt, there's a full government budget constraint, there's distortionary taxes on capital and labour income, so capital income being profits, rents, dividends, and there's also distortionary taxation on consumption expenditure. So there's productive government investment in the model, so that's introduced according to Baxter and King. Have fiscal instrument feedback rules, so the idea is all the fiscal instruments can respond to deviations of debt from its target. I've got rule of thumb consumers to break Ricardian equivalents. I've introduced local currency pricing as a way to sort of better match import dynamics relative to exchange rate dynamics, and then monetary policy set according to a Taylor rule where I allow for a binding lower bound on interest rates. So these fiscal consolidations I'm going to model as a deterministic transition path from a high or higher net debt to GDP steady state to a low or lower net debt to GDP steady state using the full non-linear model. So when I do that, there's a number of key modelling choices I need to make. So what the initial net debt to GDP ratio is. So I'm going to assume that's going to be 50%. So that's where net debt to GDP is projected to go to in the next 5 years. So I'm assuming that at that level, government stabilises it, and then some future point, either the current government or some future government decides that they want to bring down net debt to GDP. Have to decide how big the reduction in net debt to GDP is going to be. So in the baseline projections, I'm going to assume a 10% reduction in net debt to GDP, although I'm also going to look at what a 25% reduction would look like. On top of that, I need to decide which instruments adjust in the short run and which fiscal instruments adjust in the long run. So in the short run, we need to run larger primary surpluses to pay down debt. So that means we either have to increase taxes, cut government spending, or do both. In the long run, once we've paid down debt, we have lower debt servicing costs, which means we can run lower primary surpluses, in which case we can actually end up cutting taxes or increasing government spending. Also, another key decision here is the speed of adjustment. So in the baseline projection, I'm going to assume it takes 10 years to bring net debt to GDP down. And then on top of that, we might want to think about adding shocks or business cycle effects. I'll be looking at how the imposition of the lower bound affects those results. So we have 9 different policy instruments or combinations of instruments we can look at. So I'm going to assume we use the same instrument to adjust in the short run as we use in the long run. So I've got consumption taxes, capital taxes, labour taxes in the model. In the short run, we'd need to increase those guys to increase the primary surplus. In the long run, we can cut those guys as debt servicing cost falls and we can run lower primary surpluses. The opposite holds for the expenditure variables. So I've got government consumption, government investment, which is productive, transfers, payments. So in the short run, we need to cut government expenditure, but in the long run, once we've brought debt down, we can actually raise government consumption, government investment, transfers. Then I look at a combination of all 3 expenditure variables responding, and then I look at a combination of all tax variables responding, and then I look at a combination of all instruments responding. So in terms of assessment, I'm going to mainly focus on GDP costs using something called the fiscal sacrifice ratio, which I'll introduce later on. Basically, it's the average amount of GDP lost per 1% cut in the net debt to GDP ratio. I'm also going to look at welfare measures if I have time, and there I'll be looking at consumption equivalent variation. So how much consumption do you have to give people to make them indifferent between going through a fiscal consolidation and not going through a fiscal consolidation? As Eric mentioned, and as others have mentioned before, New Zealand and other developed countries face fiscal headwinds. We have an ageing population. We have increasing health spending, or it's projected to increase. We have infrastructure deficit. We have the issues of climate change, all these sorts of things. I'm not going to capture that in this modelling framework. I'm going to assume that R is greater than G in the long run, so we're not going to get any help here from growth being greater than interest rates in the long run. I won't be capturing intergenerational aspects, or those will definitely be an issue here, but I'm not capturing that in the framework. I'm not going to look at distributional aspects either. And then finally, while my main focus is on GDP isn't everything, as the sign says back there. We're sort of concerned about higher living standards, and there are sort of other aspects that we could consider as well, but at the same time, GDP is quite an important variable. So this was just some very quick algebra I did to show sort of that in the long run, if we lower net debt to GDP, which is the lower B there, that we could then have, or that would then mean that we can have lower primary surpluses, which means we either cut taxes, increase expenditure, and both those guys are going to increase GDP. But in the short run, on the transition path, in order to pay down debt, we need to run larger primary surpluses, which either means cuts in expenditure, increases in taxes, or both, and both those guys are going to pull down GDP. So start off by looking at the long-run gains from a fiscal consolidation. So assume we're in a world where government has stabilised net debt to GDP at 50%, and then they go through either a 10% reduction in debt or a 25% reduction in debt. So I've got all 9 policies up there. The first thing to note is that all policies will result in an increase in GDP in the long run once we've gone through the fiscal consolidation. But I'll just focus on the policies that result in the largest gains in GDP. So capital taxes being the most distortionary tax there. If we go through a fiscal consolidation where we can actually cut capital taxes in the long run, if we have a 25% reduction in net debt to GDP, that's going to result in a 0.55% increase in the level of GDP. Government investment being the most productive form of government spending. If we go through a fiscal consolidation where we reduce net debt to GDP by 25%, that's going to raise the level of GDP by 0.65%. So now we can look at what the short-run dynamics look like. So start by looking at the tax-based policies for fiscal consolidation. So the solid blue line is consumption tax-based fiscal consolidation. The dashed line is a capital tax fiscal consolidation, and the dotted line is a labour tax-based consolidation. So we're looking at a 10% reduction in net debt to GDP over 10 years. All policies result in a reduction in GDP in the short run. So capital taxes being the most distortionary tax in the model results in the largest fall in GDP. And then consumption taxes being the least distortionary tax results in the smallest fall in GDP. In terms of inflation, we get much larger sort of inflationary response for capital tax-based consolidations and labour tax-based consolidations. So these 2 policies have quite large effects on the costs for firms in the model. Firms then pass that on in terms of higher inflation. So it looks quite stagflationary in terms of the policy. You do get a small increase of inflation for the consumption tax-based consolidation, and that's because the exchange rate depreciates, which then causes inflation to increase. The nominal interest rate tracks look very similar to what's going on to inflation. We can also look at what that means for the individual fiscal instruments. For the consumption tax-based fiscal consolidation, we'd need to raise consumption taxes from 15% to 19%, so that's a 4% increase in the short run. For a capital tax-based consolidation, we need to raise tax rates from 28% to 35%, and then for a labour tax-based consolidation, we'd need to raise labour taxes from 18% to just over 21%. So the size of the increase in taxes reflects, in some respects, the size of the tax bases. So the consumption tax base is nearly 60% of GDP, the capital income tax base is assumed to be 30% of GDP, and the labour income tax base is assumed to be 70% of GDP. So because capital taxes are also more distortionary, you need to increase taxes by more than you would to get the same amount of revenue. We can also look at expenditure-based fiscal consolidations. So the solid red line is the government consumption-based consolidation, dashed red line is the government investment-based consolidation, and dotted line is a transfers-based consolidation. So the government consumption-based consolidation is the most costly in the short run, and the transfers-based is the least costly in the short run. Government investment's somewhere in the middle, although what is interesting is that the government investment-based consolidation has larger sort of long-run impacts, that the whole profile of GDP is pulled down. That's quite interesting because sometimes it's government investment that's the first thing that gets cut during a fiscal consolidation. We can look at what that means for the inflation profiles. Because government investment has quite a large sort of negative supply side effect that causes inflation to increase. We get sort of much smaller increases in inflation for the government consumption and transfers-based consolidations just because they cause the exchange rate to depreciate. And again, the nominal interest rate profile looks quite similar to what's going on with inflation. We can look at what that means for the individual components. So for a government consumption-based consolidation, we need to cut government consumption by nearly 15%. For a government investment-based consolidation, we need to cut that by 40%. For a transfers-based consolidation, we need to cut that by 25%. So again, this sort of reflects the overall size of those expenditure components. I'm assuming government consumption makes up 15%, government investment makes up 5% of GDP, and transfers payments are roughly 9% of GDP. We can look at the combined tax policy, the combined spending policy, and the combined tax and spending policy. So the combined tax policy is a solid green line, the combined spending policy is the dashed green line, and then the combined tax and spending policy is the dotted line. All three policies result in a reduction in GDP, although it looks like the GDP profiles are quite similar. The tax-based policies have a larger inflationary impact because they have a larger impact on the supply side, and the interest rate profiles look very similar to what's going on with inflation. And again, we can look at what that means for the individual components. So if we spread the consolidation around a larger number of instruments, the overall amount we have to move them is much smaller. So for the expenditure-based policies, where we assume government consumption, government investment, and transfers payments are cut, we only need to have an 8% cut in those three guys. If we spread it around both taxes and expenditure, then we only need sort of about a 3% cut in those guys. And the same story for taxes, that if we spread it around all three taxes, then we only need to raise consumption taxes by about 1%, capital income taxes by 2%, and labour taxes by just over 1%. And then if we spread it around both tax instruments and expenditure instruments, then we don't need to raise taxes by that much. We only need to raise consumption taxes by 0.5%, capital taxes by 1%, and labour income taxes by 0.5%. So we've seen that all these policies cause a fall in GDP in the short run. So what I'm going to do is try and quantify what the relative fall in GDP is for these different guys to assess which is more costly in terms of the amount of GDP we have to give up. So Ursig and Linde first introduced this idea of a fiscal sacrifice ratio, and then Scheer refines it, makes it look more like a conventional sacrifice ratio that we see in monetary economics. So on the numerator there, we've got the sum of the output gaps up to date T, and then on the denominator we've got how much the net debt to GDP has moved from its initial condition. So what that's telling us is the average GDP loss for a 1% reduction in the net debt to GDP ratio, and of course a lower number is going to be better. So we can plot all the fiscal sacrifice ratios on there for all the different policies. There's quite a bit going on there, so I'm just going to focus on which are the most costly policies and which are the least costly policies. So the most costly tax-based policy is a capital tax-based policy, as illustrated by the dashed blue line. In that case, the fiscal sacrifice ratio peaks at nearly 2.5. Then it starts to come down. It starts to come down as the output gap turns positive, as we move into a world where capital tax is now lower and the level of GDP is higher. The most costly expenditure-based policy is the government investment-based consolidation. In the short run, the fiscal sacrifice ratio is quite low, but as we go on, that increases, and that peaks at 25 years after the fiscal consolidation starts. The cheapest or the least costly consolidations are the consumption tax-based consolidation, which peaks at just below 1, and the cheapest expenditure-based policy is the transfers-based policy, which peaks at just over 1. So I can go through and see how, or we can ask the question, how does the duration of the fiscal consolidation and the size of the fiscal consolidation affect the result? So we can look at it capital tax-based fiscal consolidation. The blue lines are 10-year fiscal consolidations. The red lines are 5-year fiscal consolidations. The solid lines are 10% fiscal consolidations, and the dashed line are 25% fiscal consolidations. So what we see is the size of the fiscal consolidation doesn't matter that much. It's more the duration. That short, sharp fiscal consolidations are less costly. So the idea being that these fiscal consolidations are a surprise to agents in the model who raise taxes in quite a sharp way and then cut them quite soon afterwards. Agents don't really have enough time to respond. They're also forward-looking in that they know they're going to get to the new long-run equilibrium where capital taxes have actually been cut. So the distortion is much smaller than if we sort of prolong these consolidations. It's the same story for labour taxes, that the size of the consolidation matters less than the duration, that shorter, sharper consolidations are less costly, and this is a result that Ursig and Linde found in their work as well. In terms of government investment, it's the opposite story here. The size of the fiscal consolidation matters more. So because there's diminishing returns in government investment, larger cuts are actually going to be more costly than smaller cuts in terms of the amount of GDP that's lost. For all the other fiscal instruments I looked at, the size and the duration of the consolidation didn't seem to matter too much in terms of fiscal sacrifice ratios. Can also look at some sensitivity testing, so look at some key parameters, the degree of nominal rigidity, so that's what the top row is there, so how the slope of the Phillips curves, how that affects the result. The second row is the degree of elasticity in labour supply, how that affects the result, and then the share of rule of thumb households, that's the bottom row there. So let's pick out some key fiscal sacrifice ratios. So again, looking at a 10% reduction over 10 years. So for the capital tax-based consolidation, the degree of nominal rigidity has quite a large impact on the fiscal sacrifice ratio. The flatter the Phillips curves, there's less of the cost that's passed on to consumers, so the overall cost of the consolidation is lower. That's the same for labour tax-based consolidations. For the slope of the labour supply, for the labour supply elasticity, the more elastic is the labour supply curve, the more costly is a fiscal consolidation, especially when we're looking at labour tax-based fiscal consolidations. And then finally, the greater the share of rule of thumb households, the more costly is fiscal sacrifice ratios, and that's sort of more prominent in government consumption-based consolidations, transfers-based consolidations, and labour tax-based consolidations. So I'll just quickly go through the welfare results. Overall, the results are very similar. So what I do here is I look at the welfare gains or losses for agents in the model when we go through a fiscal consolidation, and I convert that into consumption equivalent units, and I do it in the first unit. So how much do we have to give consumers, how much steady-state consumption do we have to give consumers in the first period to make them indifferent between going through a fiscal consolidation and not going through a fiscal consolidation. And I should mention there's no government consumption or investment in the utility function. Those could easily be added, but there'd be some sort of decision in terms of how you'd weight that. So for the moment, I'm just ignoring that. So positive number indicates that the fiscal consolidation is actually beneficial to agents in the model. A negative number indicates that it's costly for them to go through the fiscal consolidation. So again, I look at a 10% reduction over 10 years, a 25% reduction over 10 years, a 10% reduction over 5 years, and a 25% reduction over 5 years. So the two most costly policies, again, are the capital tax-based consolidation and the government investment-based consolidation. And here we actually see that the consumption tax-based consolidation is actually beneficial to consumers. That's because real interest rates are lower on the transition path than they are under the capital tax-based consolidations, and consumption is not crowded out in the long run as it is for the government consumption and government investment-based consolidations. Finally, I'll just look at how the interaction, how the lower bound changes the results. So I've got all 9 fiscal consolidation policies up there. The solid line again is a 10% reduction over 10 years. The dashed blue line is how the fiscal sacrifice ratio changes at the lower bound. The dotted line is the with the zero lower bound added with more rigid prices, just to show how inflation affects the results. So the two sort of main demand side policies, the government consumption-based policy and the consumption tax-based policy, they're both much more costly at the lower bound, as indicated by the higher fiscal sacrifice ratios. But what is kind of interesting is that the policies that were more sort of supply side, they have negative fiscal sacrifice ratios. So the idea being that these policies generate so much inflation that the real interest rate actually falls, and that's large enough to offset the negative implications of the fiscal consolidation. So it's kind of an interesting result, but I'm a little bit sceptical to that result. So the model doesn't have a paradox of toil. So Egerton talks about how positive supply shocks at the lower bound can actually be contractionary because they cause deflation, and then that causes real interest rates to increase. So this is sort of what Ruben was mentioning before. But I've been through and looked at this model. It is the case that the demand shocks are amplified at the lower bound, whereas the supply shocks are damped at the lower bound, but the signs still look right. But the same drivers of the paradoxes of toil are at work here, and so these policies that are more inflationary are actually causing the real interest rate to fall, and that's enough to sort of offset the contractionary effects of the fiscal consolidation. So as I mentioned, I think it's an interesting result, but I think it requires further investigation and should be taken with a grain of salt. So just to conclude, it's got the main results up there. I think it's a useful piece of information in a much more complicated decision. In future work, I'd like to incorporate a negative R minus G, given that's the world that we live in at the moment, and do further sensitivity testing to understand the lower bound result and try and incorporate natural rates into the result as well.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks to the organisers of the conference for inviting me along to discuss this paper. So, so thinking about the fiscal response to COVID. So as Carolee said this morning, it was swift, it's substantial. Wage subsidy policy, great piece of either you call it operational or actual public policy. Fantastic, but of course it kind of blows out the debt level. So I take kind of Andrew's paper as saying, well, if we wanted to return debt back towards what we thought was a more prudent kind of level, how would we go about that, and what might the cost be? Now, if I start thinking about fiscal policy, I'm kind of glad that I kind of got out of monetary policy and went to the private sector. It just looks, this is a quote from Eric, darned hard. I'd say it's damn hard, yeah? So I've got to think about what happens in the steady state, for example. Don't need to worry about that with monetary policy. It's all about medium term. Don't worry about the steady state. If I think about the heterogeneity of agents, probably matters a lot more for fiscal policy than it does for monetary policy. I've got to think about what expectations matter. So the debt goes up. Do I expect that I need to think about a tax, that my taxes are going to go up in the future? I need to think about anticipating kind of, is it the announcement that I care about, or is it actually when the policy kind of hits the road in terms of the impacts? And finally, as Carolee kind of pointed out this morning, it's political. It's much easier to kind of lower or reduce kind of fiscal policy than it is to tighten fiscal policy further down the track. So to answer all those kind of questions, I think Andrew's made a really smart choice. So he's taken this model from Eric Leeper. It's about 10 years old, but it gives you kind of the right mix. It's got all the elements that need to be in there and sort of nothing more. So he's got a world where he has hand-to-mouth consumers, so that's to dampen down some of the wealth effects that you would otherwise see. He's also got monopolistically competitive intermediate firms, and that's to get you the kind of dynamics that you might want to see when you're an inflation targeter, thinking about the impact of consumption investment through into inflation channels. And he has some firms that actually combine those intermediate goods to actually produce that final consumption good. And that helps give you a cost channel that you kind of need there. Then on the fiscal side, he's got tax revenue, he's got tax cuts that come from consumption, he's got investment, and he has labour taxes as well. And then he adds in monetary policy, pretty simple Taylor rule with the effective lower bound, but there's certainly enough going on in the model to not overcomplicate things. And then he has the open economy as well. So where am I going here? Sorry, team. And I guess my take on this kind of model is Andrew was kind enough, he didn't send me the paper, but he sent me the slides. He sent me the parameterization. He sent me his code. He talked me through what was going on. And when I kind of look at all that, it looks empirically kind of reasonable to me. I can't see, anything obvious that kind of stands out as, look, that doesn't look quite right to me. And one kind of way of thinking about that is to actually not look at the kind of the data that he's matching with the model, but to actually think about these kind of tax rate changes. To me, they kind of seem ballpark. If I think about the magnitude of the kind of change he wants to make in kind of that net debt to GDP ratio, thinking about these consumption taxes, that kind of profile, and that kind of labour to income tax change seems to me within the order of magnitude of what will kind of get you there. So I kind of like the model setup that he has. Now, Andrew kind of simply says, look, I can see this kind of data here where we've got this trend in kind of the interest rate that goes down over time. And on the left-hand side of this chart, I've actually showed that kind of 5-year trend against a 5-year growth rate for nominal GDP. And so there's plenty to suggest that we're in a world where R is actually less than the nominal growth rate. And in that world, it's kind of becomes quite important because it actually kind of, in my view, resets what we mean by prudent. So no longer do we need to think about actually if we want to reduce the level of debt, do we actually have to increase taxes to make that happen? To me, that kind of says something a little bit different about what we mean when we say prudent. Now, I'm not saying that debt is kind of costless, but I think it kind of resets how we think about that. Now, in this world, in this paper, we've got R greater than G, and in some ways you might think, well, that's not the world we live in, that's kind of a mistake. But I think for a real kind of cost-benefit analysis, when you're looking across all the possibilities, you don't want to discount the possibility that these favourable debt dynamics could actually change in the future. So you actually need to go through this analysis, even if you believe you're on the world on the right. So Andrew uses GDP and welfare to actually think through, well, what are the costs of these kind of policies? Long-run benefits of getting debt down. It turns out that taxing capital and government investment, reducing government is quite costly. If you are using distortionary taxes, better to get it done over with it than actually have those in place for a prolonged period. And he also has some non-linear impacts. So if you need to do more, the worse things kind of get over time. And it turns out that, look, if you need to do a bunch of stuff, you're better off actually using several taxes at once and using sort of all the tools in the toolkit rather than using one particular lever to do all the work for you. So I had a couple of questions, and we've sort of had a GFC, we've had a COVID shock, but also I think there's kind of this third dimension that we don't talk about as much as we should. So we've had a 10% population growth in the space of 5 years, and simply when I kind of do go through the maths of how that would actually affect nominal GDP, how that would affect the nominal GDP to debt ratio, it seems as though that's something that we want to have as part of the analysis. Now, there's a whole debate about what happens going forward from here, but this is the stock of existing debt. So if we increase the population, at least we want to think about that as another policy option compared to the tax changes that Andrew really usefully goes through in his model. So there's two ways you could go about this. You could either add population growth to the model, or you could use some other technologies to get you there. Now, kind of Leaper's paper, it talks about the morass of kind of fiscal multipliers, and the paper's kind of point is, look, I can really take a couple of models and actually sort of cut through that for the US literature. But I think it kind of points to this kind of area. There's a wealth of different multipliers. There's a wealth of different costs for getting the debt to GDP down. So potentially what you might want to do, in addition to the sensitivity analysis that Andrew has actually covered, is actually to map out, look, what are the types of policies that actually work well within one type of model. And on the right-hand side, I've got a very stylized diagram. Maybe model one's Andrew's existing model, and model two's a different type of model. Maybe it's got population growth. Maybe it's got another couple of features. And then actually thinking, well, what are the policies that I like because they do well in both states of the world? So just to summarise, I think this is a great kind of modelling addition. It's precisely the right kind of tool you need to use to address these kind of structural change type questions. Turns out capital taxes are costly, consumption less so. And there's a strong need for robustness checks. And actually, look, let's try and add migration into some of these debates. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kirdan. Thank you, Andrew. Do you want to respond to any of Kirdan's comments now, or should we just open the floor up? I think we've opened the floor. Yeah. Dominic's got a question.
Thanks very much for a great presentation. It feels like a big result that's coming through, Andrew, if I've understood you correctly, is sort of, and in Yifei's paper earlier, don't touch government investment because it leads to, it unleashes, it's a positive supply shock and unleashes growth. Whereas if you touch government consumption, it has less effect on sort of long-term economic outcomes. And I wonder, the question to you is how much do your results sort of depend on that idea? And the challenge is, it feels like a bit of a long bow to draw to me. This idea that government investment is necessarily going to unblock productivity. There's a certain cycle bridge with a pretty low benefit to cost ratio right near my house. And what we typically term government consumption could well have long-term GDP impacts. Mental health spending, social spending could well have long-term, could be thought of really as investment, social investment, and have a long-term impact on growth. So I just wonder, are the results being driven by this idea, and is it a bit of a false dichotomy?
Yeah, so I'd make 2 points. One is there is a key parameter in there for tuning for how productive government investment is. And I followed what Eric Leeper does in his paper and set it just so that the marginal product of public capital is slightly lower than the marginal product of private capital. I know of people who've tried to estimate that parameter. It's a very difficult parameter to estimate. So yes, if you set that parameter equal to zero, then government investment would be exactly the same as government consumption. And in terms of your other point, what you're suggesting is exactly what Stephen Turnovsky does in his work. He actually assumes that education and health and these other things actually look like government investment, and the sum stock of capital, it might not be physical capital, but the sum stock of capital that you're investing in, and that sort of improves productive capacity. Again, you could do that, but you'd have the same problem in terms of calibrating or estimating what the right coefficients would be, but those are both good points, yep. Yep.
I don't know. Is that on now?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. So I just want, but actually my comment and questions relate to the point Dominic's raised. There's a body of literature in the early part of your presentation which you did not mention, but I think is pertinent, is the literature on the growth effects of components of government taxes and spending. And there's quite a rich body of literature. And that literature, if I can summarise it, is quite, your results are quite consistent of the conclusions of that literature. And it is that decisions, if you increase spending on so-called consumption or investment, anything that enhances investment behaviour, either through government spending on investment or reducing taxes that impinge on investment, benefit growth. Those that impinge on consumption do not benefit growth. So your deviations around your natural rate are consistent with that, but this is about growth literature. So my question is, the reason why you get those deviations consistent with the conclusions of the growth literature, and secondly, I think if you did build in a function which explains the natural rate and made that a function of also these investment versus consumption, taxes and spending, might enhance your results.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert in that area, and there's probably other people who are more knowledgeable than me, but I suspect those models you're thinking about are sort of AK type models or something, or some sort of model where there's some accumulation of physical capital, and that's what's driving your growth, in which case the same thing that's giving you the level results is also probably going to give you the same thing that has the growth effects, yeah.
Any final questions? No? Oh, yes. We'll take Anna's as the last question, and then we might just about be ready to wrap up. Thank you.
Cool, thank you, Andrew. My question is around the smaller than expected difference between a small contraction and a big contraction. So by trying to cut debt between 10% and 25%, they're not having such a big result in the model than you might have expected?
Yeah, so I think one thing to take into mind is this is the fiscal sacrifice ratio, so it's the average GDP cost for a 1% reduction in net debt to GDP. So it's still going to be the case that in absolute terms, the larger reduction is going to be more costly than, or probably going to be more costly than the smaller reduction, but just sort of proportionately, the larger reduction's the same as the smaller one. So I guess maybe it was a little bit surprised there, but it's the same or very, very similar result to what Ursig and Linde has found, that it's more the duration of the consolidation as opposed to the size of the consolidation.
Thank you. Just before you go, I'll just afford one question. I think, who was it said? John, I think, said it best when he said economists shouldn't fall in love with their models. And in that spirit, I mean, knowing what you know, where are the limitations of your model and what would you like to do more with it?
So I guess I'm not 100% sold on some of the supply side stuff at the lower bound. In fact, in the supply side stuff in general, I guess we've never seen sort of fiscal consolidations that have been sort of that heavy on the tax side before, so it's hard to know sort of how much inflation they would generate, but I might be a little bit sceptical to that sort of side of the model and that channel.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Can we just give one more round of applause?